I want to start with this post I saw a few weeks ago. As you can see, it describes Kamala Harris and Tim Walz as fascists, in particular for their roles in overseeing the police and in police repression of protest. This genre of commentary has grown increasingly common. I'm sure you all know what I mean. As someone who looks at leftist corners of the internet quite a bit, I can safely say I see the word fascism used to describe things that are happening right now, dozens of times a week at least. Depending on who you ask, the US will be a fascist state soon. The US is already a fascist state. The US has always been a fascist state. Israel is fascist. The police are fascist. Donald Trump is a fascist. The Democrats are fascist, or you're fascist for supporting them. Um, these are just some more examples of this kind of thing. Now, everyone in this room opposes the police. Everyone opposes the Democrats. And we can all agree on their increasingly brazen ideological unity with the right wing. We can all agree that both major parties have moved steadily rightward over the decades and have made state violence and repression, militarized border security, and imperialist war more and more acceptable in the mainstream. Bad things are happening in the social and political climate of the US, and the Democrats have been instrumental in allowing that. Um, the latest and most horrifying example of this is the normalizing of the genocide in Palestine, of course. But do we describe this as fascism? Uh, as you as you've probably already gathered, I'm going to argue no, definitely not. I think if we describe Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, about the most garden variety liberals you can imagine in 2024, if we describe them as fascist, the word has ceased to have any meaning at all. Now I can imagine someone asking, what do you care? The OP is showing that they take the threat posed by the Democrats seriously. They're on our side. Isn't that what matters? Aren't you being a bit pedantic? Well, yes, it is pedantic, but for a reason. It's not just being pedantic for its own sake. I do plenty of that too. I'm the kind of person who has strong opinions about why the plural of vinyl is vinyl. But this is not an instance of that. In Marxism, the definition of fascism is specific for a reason. And it's true that most people in the mainstream use the word fascism vaguely or inexactly. If you look it up in Wikipedia, you'll see the opening paragraph is just a generic definition of a far-right dictatorship. Most people accept this definition. Um, the result is that a lot of different people mean a lot of different things when they use the word fascism. This is also true of socialism, of course, and maybe for some of the same reasons. Um, but as Marxists, we have more specific definitions of some words that are in general use. We have a more specific or even technical definition of what the term working class means, for example. We also have a more specific definition of fascism. Okay. Um, More importantly, we believe that if you get some of these definitions wrong, it can lead to strategic mistakes in outlook in assessing what's happening and in organizing. Getting it wrong can lead you astray. Um, and just like there is with socialism, there are contrasting and competing bad definitions of fascism. You have the bad take that I already described, which I would describe as ultra left. There's a whole history of bad ultra left takes on fascism, and I'll get to that. Um, and then you have the liberal use or overuse of the term as well, which is far more common and more likely to be entertained in the mainstream, that has a different political agenda behind it and leads to different mistakes. Before I go on, yes, of course, we recognize that an actual fascist movement is on the rise, especially in Europe, but also here in the US and in other places, including Brazil and India. I think the reason these bad definitions of fascism are so widespread on the left now is that there's a lot of concern for this rampaging far right. So it's totally understandable that a lot of people have the word fascism on their lips right now. I totally get it. And the racist riots in the UK, or pogroms, as we should rightfully call them, were perhaps the most visible evidence of that recently. This was really awful, and if you're like me, it made you wonder how rapidly things are deteriorating in this world of crisis. As we'll see, fascism is a response to capitalism in crisis, and it's no wonder we're seeing this kind of activity right now. But the very reason to be precise is so we can analyze and strategize against this far-right movement. And that imperative comes out in Leon Trotsky's writings on fascism. Trotsky wrote a lot on the topic. Along with Clara Zetkin, he was arguably the most important theorist of fascism during the era when it first arose in Europe and maybe ever. The rise of fascism was intimately tied with the disastrous end of the revolutionary period in Europe in the 1920s, and that's why Trotsky paid such close analytical attention to it. This is something he wrote in a letter to a comrade in the UK in 1931. In order to be capable of foreseeing anything with regard to fascism, it is necessary to have a definition of that idea. What is fascism? What are its base, its form, and its characteristics? How will its development take place? It is necessary to proceed in a scientific and Marxian manner. So he felt it was important to get that definition right, and that's enough for us to pause and consider whether we should too. And here you see it's not a new problem. People have been getting it wrong since the dawn of fascism in the 1920s, and this is one focus of Trotsky's writing. So what is fascism? In that same letter, Trotsky said it is a plebeian movement financed and directed by big capital. The genuine basis is the petty bourgeoisie. By plebeian, he means it's a mass movement, not just something imposed from the top down or installed in a coup, something that originates in the streets. And the base of the mass movement is the petty bourgeoisie, but as Trotsky points out, some sectors of the proletariat became involved too, like the petty bourgeoisie kind of drag angry or frustrated sectors of workers with them. To illustrate this, Trotsky makes a distinction between the dictatorship of Miguel Primo de Rivera in Spain from 1920 to 1932 and the dictatorship of the OG fascist Mussolini in Italy. Primo de Rivera was an aristocrat and he had the support of the establishment, including the military. This makes it a much more standard, if no less appalling, state of affairs. Whereas the original fascist movement in Italy was made up of the frustrated petty bourgeoisie, it was a street movement, and that makes a difference. For example, Trotsky points out that Mussolini had difficulty bringing the traditional military establishment into his project, at least at first, which was the project which was at first driven by street militias and paramilitaries and other thugs. This was true of the Nazis too. And just to reinforce the point that there are other kinds of dictatorship, historically speaking, like Napoleon would be an example, part of the problem is that since World War II, the image of fascism has kind of colonized the concept of dictatorship and authoritarianism, understandably so, because it was so historically awful. Hitler and the Nazis were. On the other hand, there's also the dictatorship of capital, but that's another conversation, and I'll get to that in a minute. A reminder of the definition of petty bourgeoisie. When we Marxists use that term, and it's another one that we're very specific about, it means small business owners, middle managers, bureaucrats, doctors, lawyers, priests, and others who don't depend on wage work for a living. They're not the big bourgeoisie, the investor class who run society, and they're not workers who are dependent on a wage from the investor class. They're people who either own their own businesses or they do contract work, or they are executives who are paid a high salary to manage other workers. They feel like they create their own wealth through their own hard work and virtue. They tend to be more individualistic, if not outright more conservative than average workers, and they avoid mass politics during ordinary times. For example, they want nothing to do with unions. The petty bourgeoisie roughly correlates to middle class. That's not an exact definition because you can earn a higher wage and live in a middle class neighborhood and still be of the proletariat, but just it's okay. We do sometimes say middle class. The point is that when the petty bourgeoisie or the middle classes experience crisis and suffer and fear being displaced or pushed into the ranks of the working class or the poor, that's when they often panic, get angry, lash out at others, whether it's immigrants or Jews or LGBT folks, and that's when they'll set aside their aversions to organized politics and start to cohere into reactionary movements. There might be significant numbers of ex-soldiers in their ranks. This was true in Germany, where ex-soldiers who had been through World War I felt abandoned by society, and that can give the movement a militaristic vibe. In fascism, there's also an extra step involved, which is that during a crisis, such as the crises of Europe between the wars, such as the crisis in Chile in 1973, the capitalist class identifies that this process happening and uses these angry petty bourgeoisie to their advantage and finances and arms them in paramilitaries to do their dirty work in repressing the proletariat. At these times, there's revolutionary potential in the workers' movement, as there was in Germany during the revolutions in 1918 and 1919, and in Italy during the revolution of 1920, and in Chile in 1973, there was a revolution. At this point, big capital fears for its survival. The decision is made that they can no longer rely on ordinary ordinary bourgeois democracy, that's capitalist democracy, and it becomes necessary for them to arm bands of petty bourgeoisie to smash the workers' movement. What follows is a state of things where capital is still in charge, but there are no more workers' movement and no more democracy. As Trotsky put it in a 1932 essay, at the moment, that the normal police and military resources of the bourgeois dictatorship, together with their parliamentary screens, no longer suffice to hold the society in a state of equilibrium, the turn of the fascist regime arrives. Through the fascist agency, capitalism sets in motion masses of crazed petty bourgeoisie and bands of declassed and demoralized lumpen proletariat, that's like criminals and unemployed. All the countless human beings whom finance capital itself has brought to desperation and frenzy. The way Trotsky describes this happening in Italy in November of 1920 is the textbook case or the reference case of a fascist upsurge and takeover. And he also points out that in this process, as I mentioned before, he might drag they might drag workers with them in this uprising, in this crazed, uprising. Another thing I want to stop and point out here is that Trotsky refers to ordinary bourgeois democracy as a dictatorship, the dictatorship of capital over workers and other classes. That's what we live in, and that's what capitalism has been for centuries. This is why Marx, Engels, and Lenin called for a dictatorship of the proletariat, the only thing that can bring an end to the dictatorship of capital. The takeaway here is that capital functions like a dictatorship under normal times, and this is exactly why when you label its more violent or repressive traits as fascism, it's an error, one of the primary errors I'm addressing here. So Trotsky identifies three key traits of a fascist state. In his words, it means workers' organizations are annihilated, the proletariat is reduced to an amorphous state, and a system of administration is created which penetrates deeply into the masses and which serves to frustrate the independent crystallization of the proletariat. And I think by a system of administration, he means extensive police repression, the Gestapo and stuff, but also an expanded bureaucracy. That's one way that the Nazis dealt with the unemployed, was to hire thousands of new bureaucrats. Returning to the present day, I want to make a few distinctions and pull out a few strands because there are overlapping meanings when people use the word fascism. So the first thing I want to distinguish is a fascist state, and we've already discussed what a fascist state is, so I won't spend too long on this point. I will assert that there's technically no fascist state in the world today. I'd be interested to hear if comrades in the discussion think that one might exist somewhere in the world today, but I don't actually think there is if we stick to this definition. Second thing to distinguish is the fascist movement itself, the small but growing minority of people who openly support fascist politics. They may organize with greater or lesser success depending on conditions on the ground, and conditions have been more favorable for them the last decade or so. In this category, there are two subcategories. The first of these is the street movement. Rick Kuhn here in Australia calls them the Boot Boys. These are familiar to us. In the US, we have the Three Percenters and the Proud Boys and so on. You have, and the Proud Boys would be an example of the ones who maybe have better marketing. They avoid Nazi imagery, and this is one way they appeal to a lot of frustrated and confused young men. And then on the other hand, you have the outright fucking neo-Nazis who embrace all that. These assholes in Ohio last year at a drag queen story hour, which was defended by some of our comrades there. Explicitly referencing Nazi Germany, this really grotesque slogan, Weimar conditions require Weimar solutions. And that's referring to the Nazi view that the Weimar Republic in the 1920s was corrupt and degenerate, and they're tying that in with gay and trans visibility. I mean, these were kids at a drag queen story hour that had to walk through these guys to get, it's just so infuriating. These people are obviously clowns, but they felt safe enough to mobilize, in this case, And then the second subcategory are the ones who work in the political sphere and wear suits and ties and are a bit more palatable in the mainstream, but they are very much fascist themselves. A prime example of this is the AfD, or the Alternative for Germany. Last month, I attended a talk on the rise of the far right by a revolutionary socialist in Germany named Ellie Koch. She was really great speaker. It was really unsettling hearing about what's happening there, how the AfD has through their campaigns against immigrants and preying on the downwardly mobile middle class's fears about austerity and immigrants and the great replacement and so on. They've really legitimized the same kind of politics that were practiced by the Nazis, in a serious way. And they've gained a lot of power in certain states in just 10 years since their formation. This is a map of, I think this map is a couple years old, so it might even be more now. Um, the percentages represent the percentage of seats that they have in the state assemblies. And just this week, the AfD made a huge gain in the state of Thuringia, winning the vote in a state assembly election, the first for a far right since the downfall of or the first for the far right since the downfall of the Nazis, which is really, bad. Though it is unlikely they'll be able to form a government because the other parties have ruled out working with them. But they are quite strong, as you see, in several assemblies. And they're part of a far right coalition that has a number of seats in the European Parliament, too. An important point Koch made in her talk was that the AfD has strong connections to the street movement, the Boot Boys. And in some towns in Germany, immigrants have to worry about even doing like day-to-day things like going to the grocery store. They're also really good at exploiting social media, including TikTok, to appeal to a younger audience. And that combination of political power plus a street movement is how fascism happens. I mean, it's not just Nazi imagery; like it's the way they combine those forces, right? It's a very serious stuff, and I don't think there's anything happening on this kind of scale in the U.S. Trumpism, as it is today, really can't compare. This would be like if the Proud Boys had a political party that was dominant in several state legislatures around the country and had a much bigger street movement at the same time. But Koch did talk about how the AfD is in touch with the far right in the US. This is an international movement, so we have to be very wary. Looking beyond Germany, there are even more mainstream politicians like Marine Le Pen, the far right opposition leader in France, and Giorgia Moroni, the prime minister of Italy, who are considered by many sober observers to be fascist, but who themselves reject that notion. So it's a bit more slippery, and they're able to navigate the mainstream a bit more. The third thing I want to differentiate is right-wing politicians who are not fascists, but who may coddle them or lend them tacit support. Donald Trump, I would say, is a good example of this. I'm just going to state this plainly. Trump is not a fascist. This might be a controversial statement for some liberals and even some on the left. But when you compare Trump to real organized fascists like we were just doing, you see he's just an opportunistic grifter who's built a reactionary following because it's convenient for him. He certainly has uncomfortable proximity to the far right, perhaps most damningly in his role in the January 6th riot. It's easy to picture someone like Trump approving of and benefiting from a fascist takeover if that were to take place. But we are nowhere near this stage yet in the US, and we at Firebrand think it's incorrect to label him a fascist for specific reasons. In an article in Tempest earlier this year, Dan Davison and Sasha Martin lay out some of these arguments. They quote historian Richard Evans, who wrote that January 6 bears no comparison to the hundreds of thousands of armed and uniformed stormtroopers and squadristi that the Nazis and fascist leaders deployed on the streets daily in the 20s and 30s to intimidate, beat up, arrest, imprison, and often kill political opponents. January 6 was a relatively disorganized and ideologically incoherent riot, nothing close to a fascist uprising, and what forces did momentarily cohere on that day have since been badly scattered and hounded by the law. So Trump has no real paramilitary movement and also no real support from the elements of the capitalist class or the military that would allow for a fascist takeover. Kit Weiner, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, and our comrade Charlie Post wrote, Trump's attempts to retain office despite losing the election failed for a simple reason: the complete absence of any interest among leading capitalists or state bureaucrats to eradicate or even weaken the constitutional order in order to extend Trump's presidency. None of the players Trump needed to play central roles in his efforts to hold on to power had any incentive to cooperate. Quite the contrary, their futures were bound up with the stability of the capitalist state, a state whose limits cannot easily be stretched by a single politician. Davison and Martin also point out that Trump himself doesn't seem to have very many allies among the big bourgeoisie. For example, he's had no rich benefactors to help him with his many legal and financial woes. And instead, he depends on selling cheap junk, as they put it, to his true believers online. He's really quite a pathetic figure. And as they say, while it's far from impossible, it would certainly be odd for the bourgeoisie to see fit to make a dictator out of the man they don't trust enough to lend money to. This is a key point. Fascism is a cudgel wielded by the ruling class when they are desperate. We're not close to that yet in the US. And for the time being, the capitalist class is very content with the Democrats, the oldest, most powerful, and most stable capitalist party in history, to run their state affairs. Now, certainly this is all dangerous enough in and of itself. You don't have to think Trump is a fascist to view him as a noxious, corrosive, dangerous figure, especially because of the movement that backs him. Trump's movement is more dangerous than he is, in my view. I'm also not arguing that a future instance of American fascism would resemble German or Italian fascism in a one-to-one way. We don't want to be that wooden in our thinking, but we have to be clear in assessing the social forces at work and not give in to panic. That brings me to the fourth thing to distinguish, uh, which is the general conditions that signal a dangerous turn to the right in society. The widespread embrace of these ideas and the emergence of an angry, paranoid, sometimes violent petty bourgeoisie. This, I think, is true of the mass movement that supports Trump. We saw more concentrated instances of it in the right-wing protests during COVID lockdown in the US, in Canada, and here in Australia. Um, and I don't think it's incorrect to say that this is the human material of fascism. These people aren't as sharply defined as the Proud Boys, but they're the ordinary people who are ready for a broader fascist movement when it does coalesce, or if it coalesces, you know. Um, if you look at the values of the people who enabled and embraced fascism in Europe in the 30s, and the values of these people today, they're very comparable. They're extreme nationalists, they're anti-immigrant, they're racist, of course. The whole concept of the nation and their national identity is tied to their racism. They have a really toxic conception of masculinity and gender roles. They're ableist, they're homophobic, they're rabidly anti-trans, and they have a whole really gross idea of purity, whether it's racial purity or gender purity, and a fear of things like contagion and weakness. This is why trans folk have been sounding the alarm about how the rhetoric now matches rhetoric toward Jewish and disabled people in Europe 100 years ago. They're also superstitious. They may or may not be a religious extremist, though they usually are in the US. And they're anti-intellectual, anti-science, anti-vax, and conspiracy-minded. It's so interesting reading Trotsky on the culture of fascism in 1933, how relatable it is for us when we think of QAnon or the way modern right-wingers are obsessed with like ancient Rome. Fascism has opened up the depth of society for politics, as Trotsky wrote, not only in peasant homes, but also in city skyscrapers. There lives alongside of the 20th century, the 10th or 13th. 100 million people use electricity and still believe in the magic power of signs and exorcisms. The Pope of Rome broadcast over the radio about the miraculous transformation of water into wine. Movie stars go to mediums. Aviators who pilot miraculous mechanisms created by human genius wear amulets on their sweaters. What inexhaustible reserves they possess of darkness, ignorance, and savagery. Despair has raised them to their feet. Fascism has given them a banner. Everything that should have been eliminated from the national organism in the form of cultural excrement in the course of normal development of society has now come gushing out from the throat. Capitalist society is puking up the undigested barbarism. It's one of my favorite Trotsky quotes. Um, uh, so the fifth and final thing to distinguish is what's bad and has always been bad under capitalism and bourgeois democracy. Police repression has always existed under capitalism. As Lenin pointed out in State and Revolution, it's a feature of the system, not a bug. Racism has always existed, again, a feature required by the system, especially since slavery was definitive for the first few centuries of capitalism. Imperialist war has always existed under capitalism. When you get fuzzy with the definition and start applying it to any instance of violence and repression, then the word loses its meaning. Is structural racism fascist? Then all of US history is fascist. What's the point of identifying a changing conditions or the threat of the far right if that's the case? We're going to look at a case study, a new book called The Black Anti-Fascist Tradition by Janelle K. Hope and Bill Mullen. It was reviewed by our own Steve Leigh on our Firebrand website. Because this isn't just an online thing. People write serious scholarly books that stretch the meaning, and that's why we have to address this. Okay. Hope and Mullen argue that all forms of Black anti-racist struggle in U.S. history have been a form of anti-fascism. In particular, they argue that Jim Crow was a fascist system, but they argue that white supremacy in general has a fascist characteristic. As they write, anti-Black fascism is enshrined within American law. Unlike European fascism, there is no need for a singular fascist regime or dictator to ensure its existence. As Steve writes, this analysis turns fascism into an amorphous influence on everything, rather than a specific structure and set of policies decided on by the ruling class in extreme circumstances. This is wrong for two reasons. It is not dialectical. It draws conclusions by comparing surface features of racism in the US with surface features of fascism, rather than looking at their essence. And it is ahistorical and anachronistic. As Steve points out, segregation in the US was most certainly a direct influence on the Nazis. This historical reality is one thing that fuels these arguments. That doesn't make it fascism, however. The two systems had very different goals, especially as regarded the working class. As Steve says, The goal of Jim Crow was to divide the poor people of the South, workers and sharecroppers, on race lines. It was to break up the unity between black and white people that had developed during Reconstruction and the populist period. The goal was not the extermination of the black race. The goal was not the destruction of working class unions and other institutions or the atomization of the working class. It was as it was under fascism. In order to succeed, the white supremacist project needed to enroll the majority of poor white people, in the oppression of black people. It had to give white people marginal advantages to encourage and maintain racial division. The problem with the approach of the black anti-fascist tradition is that you therefore let bourgeois democracy off the hook. As Marxists, we argue that bourgeois democracy is inherently repressive and oppressive, and that's why we want to overthrow it and bring about socialism. We have to make people understand that even in normal times, awful things happen under capitalism. So we can break these theoretical errors down into two broad tendencies with different bad outcomes. There's the liberal tendency to label Republicans as fascists, mainly for the purpose of electioneering, the familiar tactic of lesser evilism. Hal Draper called out this in his classic 1967 essay, Who's Going to Be the Lesser Evil in 1968. He talks about a colleague who was panicking over Ronald Reagan's election as governor of California, and who was saying, "This is how Hitler got started." The Republicans have to be portrayed impressionistically as dangerous monsters in order to justify voting for the Democrats, who then end up doing all the same things. And while Trump is more of a loose cannon than Reagan, it's still the same phenomenon at work. When Democrats call Trump a fascist, for example, in all the fear-mongering over Project 2025, they aren't being sober in their assessment of the threat, and they aren't calling for anti-fascist organizing at the grassroots level. They're just calling for votes. One way you can tell this is that they're not worried about Project 2024, as you could call it. They're not worried about the severe repression of student protests at Columbia University, where free speech and the right to assemble are being seriously challenged right now. And they definitely aren't worried about the damn genocide in Gaza. Even worse than Democrats doing this is when socialists who know better do it, who give up their principles in opposing capitalist parties in order to justify voting for Democrats to beat Trump. To name one example, our nemesis Dan Labatz argues in a recent article in Against the Current, most of us on the left, in the broad sense, fear that should he win, we would enter a period of authoritarianism, the anteroom to fascism. This is why many of us believe we must vote for Kamala Harris. Now, this is a very unserious argument in a socialist, and it has the effect of diluting understanding of the real dangers on the ground. The outcome is that you vote for the Democrats, you vote for union busting and genocide, and then you become disillusioned when they inevitably betray you. You've been told the way to fight fascism is by voting, and you see everything getting worse and you become confused or you want to give up. The second bad tendency is ultra-leftism, which leads to the conclusion that fascism is already happening now. The US is fascist or has always been, like we said. That has a really detrimental impact on your strategy. It can lead you to excessive security culture, which we already see in some orgs with the insistence that protesters mask up or blurring photos like here. Or even worse, when protests are called off because of paranoia. It can lead you to going underground prematurely, which is disastrous because mass organizing is really the best way of resisting the state and the rise of the far right. In more extreme cases, it can lead to individual terrorism, which is a foolish and useless strategy for combating the capitalist state. But more often, in ordinary people who encounter these kinds of attitudes, when they're radicalizing, it just leads to despair, nihilism, and giving up. If you think everything is already stacked against you in a fascist state, you're not going to have much hope of organizing for change. Now, as with many bad ideas on the left, what at first seems to be the product of vague thinking or a lack of analysis can in fact be traced to, you guessed it, Stalinism. This is what George Levon Weissman, who wrote the intro to our Trotsky reading, says about the Stalinist history of the misuse of the term. That so many of those calling themselves Marxists cannot define fascism any more adequately than the liberals is not wholly their fault. Whether they are aware of it or not, much of their intellectual heritage comes from the social democratic and Stalinist movements which dominated the left in the 30s when fascism was scoring victory after victory. To the Stalinists, every capitalist party was automatically fascist. Even more catastrophic than this disorienting of the workers was Stalin's famous dictum that rather than being opposites, fascism and social democracy were twins. The socialists were thereupon dubbed social fascists and regarded as the main enemy. Of course, there could be no united front with social fascist organizations, and those who, like Trotsky, urged such united fronts were also labeled social fascists. How divorced from reality the Stalinist line was may be illustrated by recalling its translation into American terms. In the 1932 elections, American Stalinists denounced Franklin Roosevelt as the fascist candidate and Norman Thomas as the social fascist candidate. What was ludicrous as applied to US politics was tragic in Germany and Austria. And then the hilarious thing is that just a few years later, they flipped the script and encouraged working with liberal parties and like the Democrats in the Popular Front, which was a disaster, but for completely different reasons. So disaster after disaster. Returning to Trotsky, in 1931, he wrote about the Communist Party of Italy and its fatal errors with regards to the fascist threat. And this talk is about overdiagnosing fascism, but as Trotsky shows, underdiagnosing it is very much a problem too. In its eyes, that is the eyes of the Communist Party of Italy, fascism appeared to be only capitalist reaction, quote unquote. The particular traits of fascism which spring from the mobilization of the petty bourgeoisie against the proletariat, the Communist Party was unable to discern. Now check out how incisive he is here about why we have to get this right when he moves on to the German Communist Party's similar errors, which were unfolding in real time as he wrote. The leadership of the German Communist Party today reproduces almost literally the position from which the Italian communists took their point of departure. Fascism is nothing else but capitalist reaction from the point of view of the proletariat. The difference between diverse types of capitalist reaction are meaningless. To insist that fascism is already here or to deny the very possibility of its coming to power amounts politically to one and the same thing. By ignoring the specific nature of fascism, the will to fight it inevitably becomes paralyzed. Now, that's one of the points I really want to be the main takeaway about the will to fight. As he says in the same essay, the first characteristic of a really revolutionary party is to be able to look reality in the face. And a conclusion you draw from Trotsky is that the best way to fight fascism is to build a revolutionary movement. As he says, the gigantic growth of National Socialism is an expression of two factors: a deep social crisis, throwing the petty bourgeois masses off balance, and the lack of a revolutionary party that would be regarded by the masses of people as an acknowledged revolutionary leader. If the Communist Party is the party of revolutionary hope, then fascism as a mass movement is the party of counter-revolutionary despair. Now, the stakes aren't as high for us as they were then, but the fascist movement is growing, and the stakes might become high at some point, you know? The only effective way to combat it is with a mass movement of workers, the oppressed socialists, and other anti-fascists in a united front. And to do that, you need to be clear in your theory and your communications. We need to be able to convince people who are just now radicalizing that we know what we're talking about. And perhaps most importantly, we also need to convince them that there's hope of victory. When you describe Kamala Harris as a fascist, it's impactful, it appeals to the emotions, it vaguely seems right, but it doesn't stand up to analysis, and therefore it's misleading. It's just an emotive buzzword. It's crying wolf. And I just want to leave you with these images of the huge mobilizations last month against the far right in the UK. You can see this chud is completely outnumbered. The lesson here is that the majority of ordinary people will oppose violence against Muslims or immigrants when it comes down to it, and they'll stand up for them. The mistake that these thugs in the UK made is thinking they represented the majority, because a lot of people resent the general conditions of the economy, or because a lot of people are casually racist, and these fasci types spend a lot of time online, so they don't really take the pulse of what's actually happening, you know? They think they represent the will of the people when they burn a mosque, and when in fact they do not. And these counter protests are so important because it helps isolate and demoralize them. We saw similar mobilizations after Charlottesville in 2017. That's how you defeat them. The more they're outnumbered, the less chance they have of building momentum. This is why organizing against them before they have a chance to build is so important. But also, and I hope this is a bit obvious, but you couldn't do this under fascism. You couldn't assemble a mass of people to stand up to fascist thugs in a fascist state. In a fascist state, all organizing has to be done underground. And this is why it's so important to organize out in the open while we still have the chance. So this image of effective anti-fascist organizing is also proof that we don't live under fascism today in the West, at least for the time being.